Okay, we're ready to go.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Alison Moser. I'm a BCBA, that's Board Certified Behavior Analyst. I'm the training manager at MeBe. I live in North County, San Diego, and I'm presenting with Missy today. A little bit about my background is I work primarily in home right now, but I have a lot of experience of working in the schools. I was an aide for a really long time and a BCBA for Carlsbad School District that's local here. So between the both of us, we have lots of experience. And Missy, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Missy. I'm an in-home supervisor, BCBA supervisor in North County, San Diego. As well, I'm also from the schools. This is actually my first year in the private sector. I spent the last 6 years in the school districts. I was a special education teacher before I was a BCBA. And then I spent the first couple of years after passing the exam in the schools.
Awesome. So yeah, between the two of us, we have quite a bit of knowledge and experience that we're able to share today. We're really excited. We'll talk a lot about IEPs, the ins and outs. All right, so let's get started. A little bit about MeBe. MeBe is a San Diego-based company that provides applied behavior analysis therapy, or ABA therapy, speech and language therapy, feeding therapy, and occupational therapy in a fun, compassionate environment. And we're not just located in San Diego, we're all over. Some of the services at MeBe, what they look like, our values are quality. So we use evidence-based therapies and cross-discipline collaboration for a lot of our clients. Transparency, communication is key, and we own and learn from our mistakes. Fun, we encourage growth to positively impact the families and the communities we serve. And individuality, which is really important. Each individual is unique. We provide highly individualized services to our families. Okay, so let's talk about our learning objectives for today. So we're going to talk a lot about the difference between a 504 plan and an IEP. They're very similar, but there's lots of minute differences between the two. We're going to talk a lot about some of those terms you might be seeing in your child's IEP and what they actually really mean. And then we'll talk about assessing red flags versus green flags in your child's IEP and parent and student rights in the IEP process. And then we have some additional resources we'll be giving you today. So let's talk a little bit about IEPs and 504s. So they're essentially education plans, but they are eligible for students K through 12. That's one of the similarities, and they help develop plans to help students be successful in an academic setting. But as far as that, there's some more kind of similarities, but there's quite a bit of differences between the two. So we'll talk about the IEP first. So a child will qualify for an IEP if they have one or more of the 13 disabilities that is listed in IDEA, and we'll talk more about what that is on the next slide. But they have to have one of the 13 disabilities or more than one. And it has to impact their learning from the general education curriculum. It's very clear guidelines as to who makes up the IEP team, and we'll talk about that. It's a written legal document that clearly states present levels of performance. So how is your child performing academically, socially, behaviorally at that time, and specific goals and how they're going to be measured, because it's all based on data, and who is responsible for ensuring that goal is run or met. So if you have a speech goal, it'll say in your IEP, in your child's IEP, that it's going to be responsible for maybe the speech language pathologist to run and track that progress on that goal. There's also going to be a list of accommodations and or modifications necessary for the student. And I want to make it very clear that accommodations and modifications are two very different things, and we'll talk about that. And then how a student will participate in general education and other school activities. And they meet one time per year, reevaluated every 3 years. And that's called a triennial, the every 3. And that's the big one where they do a lot of different assessments and they come together to make sure that we're still on the right path. And then when you go to 504 plans, they qualify for a 504 plan if they have any disability that impacts their learning in a general education classroom. So it doesn't have to be one of 13, and I'll go over what those 13 specific ones are, but it doesn't matter what the disability is. If it impacts their learning, they do qualify for a 504 plan. The 504 plan, or the team, is usually smaller and more specific to who's interacting with the student on a regular basis. It does not have to be a written document, but it does include accommodations and other supports, who provides the services, and who is responsible for ensuring that goal is run and met. I would like to state that even though it doesn't have to be a written document, it typically is. And there's no set guidelines on how often the team needs to meet, but it does mirror an IEP where it's usually one time per year and there's reevaluations every 3 years. So I want to make it really known that IEPs are very, very strict documents that have very strict sets of rules that need to be followed. 504 plan is a little bit more fluid. Typically what I see, at least with my experience, is that if a kid's been on an IEP for a long time and they start to maybe not qualify for as many services because they're meeting their goals and they're doing really well, you might move to a 504 plan before removing those services altogether. It's kind of like a fade out plan. And then there's also kids who just don't need a whole bunch of supports, and so they do qualify for a 504 plan. Okay, so let's talk about some common IEP terms. So we talked a lot already about disabilities. So for an IEP, you have to qualify for one of 13 main diagnoses that are listed in IDEA. So it's autism, deafblindness, deafness, visual impairment, including blindness, emotional disturbance, hearing impairment, intellectual disabilities, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, and traumatic brain injury. So they could have more than one, but they have to have at least one to qualify for an IEP. And we've talked about IDEA already a little bit, but I'm going to go into more depth. Individuals with Disability Act is a special education law to protect students with disabilities from birth to age 21. So typically we see kids graduate from high school at 18, but a lot of kids that do have disabilities will stay in the public school system till about 21 or 22. And so that's why IDEA protects kids up to age 21. Through this law, students must be provided with free and appropriate communication and instructions in the least restrictive environment. I'll go over both of those. And schools must assess these students who qualify and provide resources at no cost to the family. IDEA also gives parents a say in the IEP process called procedural safeguards, which we are going to go over a lot today. But I want to make it note, we've already talked about how an IEP team is pretty extensive. As a parent or a caregiver, you are just as much a part of the IEP team as anybody else. So you do have a say in the process, and we'll go over what that looks like a little bit more. And then there's free and appropriate education, or FAPE, and it provides students with disabilities with education that is free and help them achieve their educational goals with accommodations and modifications if it's needed or deemed necessary. In addition, the least restrictive environment means that the educational environment will be with other students as much as possible. And I want to make it note that LRE does not specifically refer to a place, but an overall educational package that's best for the student. And the goal is to have them with their peers as much as possible. There's going to be cases where they might not be able to be with their peers at all time, but the goal is to be in the least restrictive environment that makes sense for your child. Another term you might see is functional behavior assessment. So when Missy and I were working in the schools, this was primarily what our role was, because it's about behavior. But it's a problem-solving process to address behavioral challenges that impact the student's learning environment. So it's attempting to find the function of the behavior. So say you have a child who engages in maybe escaping behavior. We call it eloping, but it's essentially like maybe they're trying to bolt from the PE group at PE. They really don't want to do PE and they're bolting from it. The class, and they're having a really hard time coming back. They get really upset, and it's happening pretty often. So we'll come in, we'll see, well, what is it that they're trying to gain access to? What is the function of this behavior? What is the why? And then we test out strategies to help them set them up for success in what is called a BIP. So a BIP is a behavior intervention plan, and the FBA and the BIP, they work very closely together. But the BIP is a document with all of the trialed and successful strategies from the FBA process that outlines how to accurately track the behavior, how to set up the environment adequately to reduce the likelihood of behaviors, and how to respond in the event a behavior occurs, as well as what we should be teaching the student instead. So the BIP is also part of the IEP. So it's also a legally binding document. It needs to be run as written. If there's something in there that's not working, I know in the past when I was working with the Carlsbad School District and we were finding that this BIP is no longer serving its purpose. It's not teaching this child or the student the skills that I want them to teach, and they're kind of reverting back on those challenging behaviors. We will go back to the FBA process, take all of this data, see what works, and then amend the document, but it has to be approved by the IEP team. I just can't go in and make changes as I see fit. Since this is a legally binding document, just like the IEP, it has to be signed off on everybody or by everybody. So we'll talk about accommodation and modification. So an accommodation is a workaround to help the child access age-appropriate curriculum. So an example of an accommodation might be the teacher provides an outline of the material before the assignment or before the lecture, extended deadlines on assignments or exams, maybe preferential seating, like being closer to the board because they have a visual impairment. Modification is a little bit more intense. It's a change to the material or the expectation from the student, and the changes are specific depending on the areas of need. So some examples of this could be a reduction in homework, tests written with less questions, certain types of questions are omitted, simplified assignments, etc. So say you have a child or student who needs to take a test. If, say, the test is being given to this specific student, maybe instead of a paper and pencil, it's on an iPad or it's on a computer, but the test remains the same. Everybody in the class is getting the same exact questions, the same exact content. That is an accommodation. But if the student maybe needs to have less questions, or maybe only multiple choice questions, no open-ended questions, that is a modification, because if everybody else in the class is getting one certain type of test and this student is getting something a little bit different, that's a modification. So if there are any questions about the difference between those, definitely drop it in the chat box so we can help provide further clarification. But they're very different things, but they do work to serve the same purpose, which is making the curriculum more easily accessible for the student to set them up for success. Another one too, you might see is specialized academic instruction. I feel like this is the one that I see the most. It refers to specific practices that districts will provide about the content, teaching methodology, and service delivery of the general education curriculum. So how is the content being taught? Is it in a special education classroom with a special education teacher? Then it's going to be noted at the end of the IEP and how many minutes of specialized academic instruction they're going to be getting. And an amendment is a process for making minor, slight changes to an IEP that may not require a formal meeting. So we talked about IEPs meet every year and then every 3 years for the triennial. And then maybe, like I said, if I have to make an update to the child's BIP or the behavior intervention plan because it's just not working anymore, we need to update it. Maybe I get it approved by the IEP team and we don't need to meet to go over it because it's not that big of a deal. Everyone signs off on it. It looks good. It's a very minor change. We don't have to all come together and find a day that works for us all to sit down and have a meeting. In addition, due process is a formal way to resolve any disputes or conflicts in the IEP process. This is typically after there's been some disagreement and they've been attempted to be resolved, but there's not any success there. So we'll talk about the due process, kind of how it works, but it's a formal dispute resolution process. We also talked about who is on the IEP team. It can be a very exhaustive list, but at the very basic, it's a parent or a caregiver. The student can attend. It's not mandatory, but it's an option. Typically, the general education teacher and the special education teacher both need to be present. SLP, like a speech language pathologist, an occupational therapist, maybe a board certified behavior analyst if there's one, an APE teacher, like an adapted PE teacher may be there. If they're working with your child because they have specialized goals in those areas, they should be present because they're going to have data on their progress for those specific goals for those areas. The school psychologist might be there, the district representative might be there, the vice principal or the principal, and then there could be a plethora of other people. And one of the things I want to make sure that it's known, you can bring anybody to your child's IEP that you want. You just have to provide notice to the teacher or whoever is helping facilitate the meeting of the IEP. Try to give them at least 72 hours notice, but if you give advance notice, you can bring anybody you want, whether that be an advocate, if you want to bring, if your child's receiving private speech therapy or private ABA therapy and you want to bring those people, you can. You just have to give them a heads up. You don't need permission, you just need to give them notice. Some other terms. Yes.
Sorry, just there was a quick question that came through on that topic. I think the question was, does that include the other parent? So can two parents attend, or is it limited?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Two parents can attend. It's not required, but there needs to be at least one. I highly encourage both parents to be there if possible. Yeah, anybody can attend. Anybody you feel it just needs to be, if it's outside of like caregivers or parents, it just needs to be, they just need to notify the team.
Also, I just wanted to jump in and say that you don't have to provide prior notice if you're bringing another caregiver. Anybody that's like a legal guardian does not have to have advance permission to attend. It's just if you're bringing anybody else, because the district needs to know if they need to have their own representative present. So if you brought like your private speech provider or your private ABA person, they're most likely they wouldn't need representation from the district. But if you were to say bring an advocate or somebody acting as an advocate, then the district would want to have their own representation. So they just have that basic rule of providing at least like 72 hours notice in advance, so they can be prepared should they need.
Yeah, exactly.
And then, sorry, I have a couple more questions here, and you can tell me if maybe you might address this later on in the presentation. But a couple questions around like how a parent can request, like for the FBA or an assessment, like an APE assessment. If the parent's requesting that, does the district need to do that, or kind of some questions around how the parents can request those kinds of assessments?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, you can request them. We will go into quite a bit of detail about how to go about that and what it looks like. So we will address that later for sure. It's very important stuff.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, a couple of other terms you might see on your child's IEP is positive behavior intervention supports, which is focusing on providing preventative strategies rather than waiting on a behavior to happen and then having all of these reactive strategies. It's all about building up an environment where the behaviors are, the challenging behaviors are less likely to occur. And it consists of multiple tiers. Most schools will use something like this. They might not call it PBIS, but essentially every school does. And it's usually a tiered system. So you have tier 1 down here, which is school-wide interventions. And most of the time that's just rules. Every school's got rules. All the kids have to learn the rules. And they might have like an acknowledgement system. There's active supervision out on the field or engagement. And then I know a really common one in our area is like the behavior management system called Classroom Dojo. I'm sure most people have heard of that, but it's like a point system and every class uses them. And then it like you can look at how the overall behavior and engagement is with the school. And then you get into tier 2, which is a little bit more specialized because it's for learners who are at risk for academic or social challenges because of behavior challenges. So that might look like, you know, more check-in and checking out with specialized instructors, maybe social skills group, maybe small group counseling, maybe conflict resolution circles. It really looks different at every school, and this is just a very small list. And then you get up to tier 3, which is individualized interventions for students with intensive or chronic behavioral challenges. So that's where we're looking at the functional behavioral assessment, the behavior intervention plan, maybe wraparound support where you have a really multidisciplinary team that works with a child. Maybe you have a crisis response because the behaviors are very unsafe and you have to have some sort of plan in place. And then there's assistive technology, which are devices and systems that help a student improve, maintain, or increase functional capabilities for that student. So it does not necessarily mean that it's a computer or an adapted keyboard, even though those are very common ones, or maybe a device because the child can't verbally, express words. They use a device instead or an iPad, but it could be something as simple as like a slant board. Instead of writing flat on a surface, you might have like an OT might provide like a slant board so the kid can write at an angle. It doesn't have to be an electronic device. It's just anything to help aid them in their educational day. Okay, so we'll start getting into some of the questions that were in the box, but I do want to give a disclaimer. All of the information provided in this presentation is general to the state of California and specific to the certain school districts in San Diego due to our experience. Every child's needs are different, and while some items are consistent across the US, there may be some minor differences that will not be addressed today, but we will try to hit the really general important ones that are pretty consistent. But I just wanted to make that known that we do work in the San Diego School District, and even in the whole San Diego area, Carlsbad might be different than Escondido, and Orange County might be different than LA, so we just need to keep that in mind.
All right, so some background information is I'm going to be going over the procedural safeguards. So the procedural safeguards is that long, like 10, 12-page document they give you at every IEP meeting. And usually it goes like, here's a copy of procedural safeguards, any questions? And usually they just kind of move right past it. And honestly, it can be a lot to take in. It's a long document. and there's a lot of jargon, and that's why we're here today to break down some of that jargon. So the procedural safeguards, just some background, are universal. So they're all based on IDEA. So like Alison said, there might be some things that vary state to state based on state law and interpretation, but the overall IEP and process is mandated by IDEA, the Individuals with Disability Act, and that's national and not just in California. So that's the thing that goes to everybody. And then again, individual states might have some minor differences. But IDEA applies to like every state in the US. So every state is required to provide a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment. And the variations kind of come in what that looks like maybe in each state, but that's what is mandated by IDEA. No matter the district, they all contain the same basic information. So at the additional resources, I linked procedural safeguards from like 5 or 6 different districts, including some in Seattle and Dallas, since I know those are also MeBe areas. And you'll see some minor differences in the organization and structure, but they cover the same basic information. And then if you move from one state to another, the state is still required to follow the child's IEP and provide the services outlined in it. And the child find clause in IDEA, also in procedural safeguards, talks about the school's responsibility to assess in areas of a suspected disability. And on that note, along with child find, you do have the right to refer your child to special education services. You would just make a written request. So prior written notice, before any kind of assessment, the school district will send home prior written notice, which says proposed assessments must be drafted in a prior written notice and sent home with all assessments checked for parents to sign before an assessment can begin. They must also be provided to the school district deny a written request for an assessment. So this is where we kind of get into the assessment questions. It's like you can make a written request, you just have to make sure it's in writing, or if you make the request in an IEP meeting, that it's documented in the notes of the IEP section. So again, it's documented in writing. And then if they deny your request, and it's in writing, they have to send home a formal document, a prior written notice explaining reasons why they are denying the request. And then again, that would kind of lead into like the formal complaint section of like making a formal complaint about the school district and potentially going to due process. So usually when you make the request, most of the time the district will just do the request for will honor the request for an assessment. And then it doesn't determine eligibility or need. It just says that they will do the assessment. So the non-discriminatory assessment clause, I'm just kind of going straight through the most important parts, the prior of the procedural safeguards. And if you look at any of the procedural safeguards for your district, you'll see that these are in bold and like different sections on there. So the non-discriminatory assessment, you have the right to have your child assessed in all areas of suspected need. You can request these at any time. All program options must be presented to you, and no one assessment determines eligibility. So that means that if you feel like in the middle of the year your child needs a speech assessment, it doesn't matter whether they're annual or triannual is the ways out. You can request that assessment at any time. You just have to make that written request to the district. Again, they do have the right to write a prior written notice and deny the request. And it doesn't necessarily guarantee eligibility for that service, but you do have the right to write that request at any time. And they must, and with all program options must be presented to you. They have to present like that they have these certain programs available in their district. Like they have general ed, they have SDC, they have self-contained classrooms. And that actually is usually covered. There's a little blurb about that in the top of the services page when they talk about it has been determined by the IEP team that this is the least restrictive environment based on, you know, these potential downfalls and these potential risks. Like we have decided this is why this is the least restrictive environment. And then no one assessment determines eligibility, means that they kind of have to look at the whole picture. So even if the child scored, for example, really high on the academic assessment, if they were still engaging in severe challenging behavior that was preventing their access to the general ed curriculum, the school still might decide to qualify them because there's still a demonstrated need, because there is still something that's getting in the way of them accessing the curriculum, even if their academic scores and their psychological scores came out really high.
Missy, I just have a couple questions. Can I ask you a couple questions real quick?
Yeah.
Sorry, and again, you can tell me if you might address these ones in a different section, but one question was on the FBA. Does an FBA need to be done in person, or or is an indirect appropriate or allowed?
I think it depends on what you mean by indirect. So right now with the COVID rules, they might not allow somebody else to come on campus and observe. So what they might do is try to do an FBA through Zoom. So have the person that they have conducting the FBA do it through observation through like telehealth or something. But they're not allowed to just fill out a questionnaire and call that an FBA. So once an assessment request has been submitted and the prior witness notice has been signed, they have 60 days to collect the data necessary, determine eligibility, and then hold the meeting.
Yeah, so I also just want to piggyback off of that. The whole point of the FBA process is that the behavior and the student themselves are being observed, whether that's over Zoom or in person. Obviously, it would be better if it was in person, but with COVID, we have much restrictions in place right now. But the point of the FBA is to be collecting data on how much is the behavior occurring? What does the behavior look like? Because if you're looking at aggression, that might look different between all students. One student might be hitting and pulling hair. One other student might be spitting and pushing. So we need to have very clear definitions of the behavior, and we can't know that if we don't see the behavior. And also we're going to be trying some certain things. Maybe we try like a reinforcement system or a visual schedule. We can't do those things indirectly, not through a questionnaire that's not going to provide enough information.
And sorry, one more question just on the IEP process. Does it need to be repeated every year?
Yes.
Yes, at minimum, you have to hold an IEP every single year. Otherwise, you're out of compliance. And that can get the district in really big trouble if they review the student, if they review the files and the school hasn't held an IEP. That can get the school or the district in a lot of trouble. So they have to have it every year. You can meet more frequently than that. You can call an emergency IEP at any time. You just request an amendment to the child's IEP. And it can be for anything as small as like, hey, there's been a major change at home and I want to let everybody know, to I think my child is really struggling and I want to talk about addressing their goals or potentially adding new goals, to I want to hold this IEP to discuss my concerns and potentially request an assessment. So the emergency IEP can be used pretty much for anything that you need. The annual is just when they have to have like new goals, whereas an emergency IEP, you don't have to necessarily have to update goals and services. It can just be documented through the notes what was talked about. But the annual IEP has to be an update. They have to present progress on previous goals at the meeting, as well as go over current present levels. And again, in an emergency IEP, they don't necessarily have to do that unless you request that, because the emergency IEP can be for any number of things.
Yeah, it's to address like a very specific need. And I also do want to add to school districts get audited by the government, because this is a government, like the government pays for this, like the State Board of Education. So school districts will be audited, and one of the things that they look at is that the meetings are happening as scheduled, and that written requests are being addressed, and that like services are being actually provided, not just stated that they're being provided. So they are held to a pretty strict standard for that.
Sorry, I know we're getting a lot of questions, but these are kind of along the same lines, and then I'll let you get back to it. So when would they typically schedule the next annual IEP for the upcoming school year?
The district should be reaching out to schedule the meeting by the date that it's due. So whatever it says. So I don't know what district it is, but most of the school districts, even throughout the US, use an IEP system called SACE. And on the first page, on the info eligibility page, it'll say date of like qualification, last triennial, next triennial, last annual, and next annual. And where it says next annual, it will tell you the meeting has to be held at this time by date. And if it's not held by that date, then in order to still be in compliance, they have to like provide like reasons why the meeting wasn't held by the time. So maybe the meeting was held, everybody met, and then somebody ended up being sick and had to leave. And so they just have to document that the meeting was attempted to be held. The IEP team was ready, maybe parent was sick and had to leave. Or parent requested a change before the day before the IEP. But this tool team, unless there is like some kind of school emergency, which we had with the COVID-19 school closures, they cannot hold an IEP past the due date without good reason.
And will a 504 plan carry over to middle school?
Yes. And high school too. The goals might change, the supports might change. If the child is eligible and deemed eligible by the school to still qualify for a 504 plan, then the 504 plan will still be instated in the new, if they transfer to a new district or they're aging out of elementary school and going on to middle school, it remains in place as long as the services being provided are still deemed eligible.
Great, thank you. I know we're getting a lot of questions. I'll let you go through these ones and then we can come back to the questions. Thank you.
Okay, so parent participation and consent, this is a really big thing. You're a participant in the team and have a right to say what goes into the IEP. You must provide written consent for any services to begin. You can authorize parts of the IEP without authorizing the whole thing. You can revoke consent for special education services at any time. And to add a little bit to that slide, you can also request a draft copy of the IEP, I believe like 3 days before the IEP, and they can send everything home up to the services page. And I think this is really helpful to know, but they can't send the services page home because the services technically have to be decided by the whole IEP team, including you, and agreed upon at the IEP meeting. And so they can't send the services home ahead of time because that would be considered predetermination. So they can send like present levels, they can send goals, and they just write draft on it because those things can be updated in the IEP. So the IEP is not finalized until everybody, including you, has signed it. It's not authorized until you have signed and authorized it. So even if they have all the goals ready and they say these are the goals we want to propose, if you disagree with the goals and you don't sign the IEP, then they have to have another meeting. So with updated goals, or if it's just a small change, like, hey, like I noticed that they are working on, CVC words. Can we expand this goal so they're working on both CVC words and CVCE words? So like short vowels and long vowels. And that might just be sure, like, let me go into the IEP system and document that, or like, and adjust that or update that and then show you really quick. But like bigger changes, like I don't like these two goals and I'd like to see something more like this. That would be okay, well, we'll end the meeting here. And then we will pick up at this time next time with the new goals presented. Educational records. So parents can access educational records and documents in your child's file at any time, and they must be provided within 5 business days of the request. And that includes everything. That includes all of their standardized test scores, any other assessments they take. Like in California, they're really big on giving the LPAC, the English Language Proficiency Exam. All of those scores would be in there. All copies of old IEPs, all copies of report cards, progress reports, all of that would be in their records. And then the next section is independent evaluation. So this is one of the things in the procedural safeguards that you might not hear a lot when you talk to the school district, because it's not something that's highlighted often, but it is in the procedural safeguards. This is straight from page 3 of the procedural safeguards from California school districts. At least the San Diego ones have it on page 3. It might be on page 4 or page 1 in a different district. But it is in all the procedural safeguards. In bold, it says independent evaluations, and this is just a summary of what it says. If you disagree with the results of the assessment conducted by the school district, you have the right to ask for an independent educational assessment for your child from a person qualified to conduct the assessment at the school's expense. If the district refuses to provide this, they have to go to due process to prove why an independent evaluation is not needed. So essentially what that means is if you request the independent evaluation, a third-party company that the school district contracts with will do the IEE. And the IEE could be for speech, for a psychological assessment. It could be an FBA. It's really common for school districts in San Diego, at least Chula Vista and San Diego Unified contracted with like an outside third party company to do their FBAs for them. So if a school psychologist did an FBA, because usually in most schools they have a school psychologist that does the FBA, they didn't agree with it. They requested an independent evaluation, and then the school district contacted the third party company that they partner with to do the evaluation. And same with a speech and OT evaluation. The district had to provide in a couple cases like third party speech and OT evals. But again, first thing is that the school district will have the evaluation done with their own personnel. But then again, the independent evaluation comes in if you disagree with the results of the assessment. And then the third party eval can be requested. But you can't skip over the district personnel doing the assessment first.
Okay, so actually, before I go into what due process is and what the whole process of due process is, I do want to make a note. I would say 90% of the IEPs I have sat on, whether I'm on the school side or the family side, because I've been in both, and so has Missy. I always hear the school say, okay, I gave you a list of your procedural safeguards. Do you want me to go over it? Because it is 10 pages and it is a lot. If you are new to the IEP process, have them go over it with you. Nobody wants to do it because it is tedious, but it's very important. But like Missy said, the first 3 pages are the ones that are the bulk of like the really important information. But I just hear, I hear it gets swept under the rug at every single IEP. I give you a copy, you good? Can we move on? And it's like sometimes, and I'm it feels like IEPs are rushed, and a lot of the times the beginning of where the rights, that your rights, your child's rights, that kind of just gets fast forwarded through sometimes, and it's really important. But if you sat in IEPs for 10 years and it's not your first rodeo, obviously you don't need to spend the time. Let's just get into the actual goals and present levels. So I just wanted to make that noted. Okay, so let's talk about due process. So this can be requested after disagreements are not resolved amongst the IEP team. I want to reiterate, as a parent or a caregiver, you are just as much of a part of the IEP team as anybody else, regardless if it's the district representative, the teacher, the principal, you are just as much a part of that team. This process only applies to disputes in special education, not general education. So make sure, that there are lots of IEPs where, maybe for math, we don't have any specialized math goals. So if you have a dispute about age appropriate or grade level math stuff, it would not apply. There are 2 types of issues that can arise. There's procedural and substantive. Procedural means anything in the process of the IEP was not properly followed. So like you weren't given prior written notice. You requested an IEP or an emergency IEP to address like a huge concern, and the IEP was not held within 30 days. Not all procedural issues are addressed in due process, only if it impacts your child's educational opportunities. So say the team didn't meet in time and the goals are old and the kid's not getting proper educational opportunities, that would qualify for a due process complaint. And then substantive or general, it's just your child's general right to an appropriate education. An appropriate education looks different for every kid. It really is just based on the individual needs. So if you want to start the due process, you need to file a written complaint. You're not going to go to due process right away. You're going to go to a resolution session or a mediation meeting that's scheduled between the school and the district and the caregivers. If a resolution is reached, or if it's not reached, then you move to a formal hearing, which is due process. And a due process complaint filed within 2 years of learning about the violation. So say you found out that your child was actually not getting, like say in their services page, it says they are allotted this many minutes of one-to-one speech therapy per week and this many minutes of group speech therapy per week. And you find out group speech therapy is not being conducted. Once you learn about that, you have 2 years from that date to move to a formal hearing. And then if you do file a due process complaint, a meeting needs to be held within 15 days. If it can't be because of one reason or another, everyone's sick or someone's sick, COVID, things were very dicey with having meetings as scheduled, it needs to be documented. And once that meeting has been held, a resolution must be attempted within 30 days. Notice that it does not say reached. It says attempted. It does not mean that everybody agrees and maybe a resolution isn't reached and then it goes to a more formal trial. Caregivers, you have a right to a lawyer to present evidence. You have witnesses attend and the right to the verbal or the verbatim written record of the hearing. I would also like to say, any sort of IEP meeting that you ever attend with your child or for your child, you can record the meeting and have it for your personal use. You just have to give them notice. I do find that a lot of parents like to do this because they like to go back and look for contradicting information. It's a really good tool to have. And also just IEP meetings are overwhelming and there's a lot of information. So you want to make sure you don't miss anything, but you have a right to, in general, record the meetings, but during due process, you can get a transcript of the entire meeting. All right.
All right, so now we're going to talk about some IEP green flags and red flags. Green flags being things that you would like to see and look for. So some green flags are definitely all team members are present or excused with excusal form signed by you before the meeting. So anybody that's written to your child's IEP has to be there. And just a quick note on that, even if your child is an SDC, 90% of the day, a general education teacher is still required to be there unless excused, because even if your child isn't attending general education, the general education teacher is still required to be there to discuss like what other kids at that age group or grade level are doing in general ed, just so you have a comparison of what same age peers are doing. So that is definitely an important team member. And then if you want to excuse the general ed teacher, you can though. If you want to excuse anybody but the administrator, you can sign an excusal form. So if there's no administrator at the meeting, the IEP meeting cannot legally be held. And just another quick note, like school psychologists can sit in some districts as admin or like district representative. There just has to be somebody in the position of administrator in order for the meeting to occur. But every other team member can technically be excused with an excusal form, but they really shouldn't present you with the excusal form the day of the IEP meeting. A green flag would be, oh, you know what? Miss Beverly, the general education teacher or the speech language pathologist won't be able to attend this meeting. She's already written her goals and her present levels. Are you okay excusing her from this meeting? And if you don't want to excuse them, then you can just ask that the meeting be rescheduled for a date when that team member is able to attend or all team members able to attend. Because that's the other thing with the excusal form is you are not required to sign it. It's optional. Another big thing is there's data in the present level, so very clear data. There should be very clear examples of what your child can do and what they're still working on. For example, Johnny can read X many words, answered X many questions, attended to X many assignments, attended X many instances of protest. Data should be clear and wording is not subjective. So for example, a very common informal assessment that teachers give is the basic phonics skills test. So they might say, on the basic phonics skills test, Johnny read 20 out of 20, identified 20 out of 26 letters and knew 19 out of 26 sounds. Johnny was able to attend to the informal assessment for the entirety, or Johnny protested 3 times during the assessment. So again, like making sure that it's very clear. It's very clear and you can have a picture in your head of what did that look like? What were they able to do and what were they not able to do? Your concerns are documented in the notes section and your input is put into the IEP. So again, if you have a concern, make sure when they read aloud the notes that's reflected into it, because the notes are kind of documentation of what occurred at the meeting. It goes over like what changes were made to the IEP, but it also has to reflect parent concerns accurately. So when they read aloud the notes, just make sure that everything that you wanted documented is in there. So any kind of formal request that you made would need to be in the notes section. Goals are developed for areas of need mentioned in present levels. So if they are reporting that Johnny is doing addition and subtraction while same age peers are doing multiplication and division, then it would be important for Johnny to have services and goals in the area of math. Also, services or assessments for services are being provided in all areas of need. And I highlight this, the all, because a lot of times there's some conflict over who or what does social emotional behavioral. And that's kind of on the school to figure out who is going to provide the social emotional behavioral support. But the school district is required to provide that somehow, or provide the FBA if there's a demonstrated need. So if they are reporting that the child is like hitting every day, or destroying the classroom every day, then that is very clearly a demonstrated need. And the district should be doing an assessment in the area of social emotional behavioral, and at the very least coming up with a BIP and conducting an FBA. So it's just something important to note, that it's not just academics, they are also required for that. Also in speech, if you had speech concerns, you can always request a speech assessment, but ideally the district is, the team, your child's school team is identifying like what needs are being presented to them and acting accordingly. So a great green flag is when your child's team says, you know what, I noticed that their fine motor skills or their handwriting is really off. I'd like to request an assessment for them to get tested by the OT to see if they qualify for services. So anybody in the IEP team can refer a child for services, or rather for the assessments for services. Like if the teacher notices it, even if the SLP notices it, they can say, hey, I think we should get an assessment done in this area. And then another great green flag is when there's demonstrated with lack of progress, services supports are adjusted accordingly. Like maybe an emergency IEP is called and they say, hey, I noticed Johnny's really been struggling lately. And so we wanted to add in, maybe a visual schedule into his daily routine to see if that helps him with his transitions. Oh, you know what? We noticed that, Johnny was really struggling in math time today. He was throwing his math books. So what we'd like to do is reduce the number of math problems that he has to do. So a great green flag is when the school is really proactive and looking for how they can best support your child. And then some red flags: missing team members without an excusal form, a demonstrated area of need with no goals or services in the area. So again, like highlighting, like if he's struggling in math, there should be services and supports in math. If he's struggling with his behavior, there should be services and supports in the behavior. Whatever is being documented in the IEP as an area of need, there should be something there to address it. Concerns and requests by parent are not documented in notes. It's kind of like the thing, like if it's not in writing, it doesn't really exist to them. Just in general, like if it's not in writing, it's really easy to say like, oh, well, I don't remember that happening, or, oh, like, I'm not sure that's what really happened. It's just really important that any concerns by both parties, school and parents, be documented in the notes. So that way everybody has a clear history of what was said and what was agreed upon. And there can be, follow through. Lack of data and present levels. So like, oh, he reads well most of the time, or, oh, he behaves okay in class, but sometimes he can be disrespectful. Again, like the data needs to be clear and objective. And same with the assessment results. So your quality FBA should have very clear data as to what occurred during the assessment, like how many times did he hit, how many times did he scream, versus just, oh, he was very defiant. So again, like those clear objective descriptions. So same to the next point, subjective statements are a red flag of child is poorly behaved, child doesn't listen, child is defiant. Clear objective descriptions. No changes to IEP and services, accommodations, modifications, even after a demonstrated lack of progress with current IEP. So if there aren't any major changes to an IEP and a child has met like none of their goals, that would be a huge red flag. Goals are set far above or below child's present levels, or it is clear in the present levels that the work being given to the child is inappropriate based on their current skills. So if there's a child that is reading at a first grade level and they're giving them fifth grade level work, that would be completely inappropriate, and it wouldn't be providing them what they need. No administrator is present. Again, like an admin has to be there as a representative of the school. It could be an admin, it could be a district representative, which counts as an admin. In some cases, it could be the school psychologist, but somebody that is representing the administrator position has to be present. Also, no presentation of procedural safeguards. The procedural safeguards have to be provided at the beginning of every meeting, and if you request an explanation of them, they have to do that. The IEP is not presented in the language requested by the family. If you need the IEP translated into a different language, or you need translation at the IEP meeting, then the school has to provide that.
In addition, if they do any sort of assessment, the results also have to be in the language that you request. And you can also require or request a translator at the meeting. You have that legal right to do so, and they have to provide that translator free of charge.
Tips for a successful IEP meeting. So keep the focus on the child and their needs, even if you're feeling dismissed. That is the key to successfully navigating the meeting. IEPs can be really emotional times. It's really hard hearing that your child is, struggling in school, and it's really hard hearing that they need a special plan to help them make progress. Those are all really hard things. And so it's really easy for things to get emotional, and then the school can get defensive, and the parents can be frustrated, and then it's just like a very emotionally charged place. So the most important thing is to just bring things back to the students, their needs, and why they need it. Yeah, I understand that that's what you're saying, that would be hard to do, but I really feel like Johnny needs, extra help in math. He's really struggling. His grades have gone down this year, and I really feel like he needs this extra 30 minutes of support in math. Or I really feel like he needs a behavior intervention plan. I'm getting notes from the school every day that he's hitting his classmates, and I think that we all really want him to be successful, and we want his classmates to be safe. So I really think that we need this, because this is obviously like an area of concern for all of us. So bringing it back to like, as a team, this is a shared concern, and we all want this child to be successful.
Yeah. And I can go over the next few. So you are an expert in your child. There's no doubt about that. That's why you are part of the team. But the district and the specialized personnel are the experts in the services they provide. If they recommend a service, or you want a service, and they've assessed and deemed that maybe that service that you want isn't the best service, but it's the one that is the most reasonably calculated. And that's actually what you see in like IEP literature and documentation and laws, is that we can agree that like maybe a service it would be the best, but it wouldn't be the best for this situation for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's not least restrictive environment or whatever that is, and we'll go over that as well. But a big one that I want to make sure everybody knows is that caregivers, you do not have to sign the IEP during the meeting. I would actually encourage you to not sign them in the meeting. I would encourage you to take the documentation home. Don't take forever to go over it, because it is a legally binding document. There are deadlines that need to be made, or else the school can get in trouble. But I find that questions do come up after the fact, and it's nice to be able to take some time and like look over the documentation yourself, and then bring up those questions, make sure they're addressed, and then adjusted if needed, and put in the notes section, and then you can sign it. But definitely, if any school administrator or any IEP team makes you feel that you have to sign it there, you're legally you do not have to. It's against the law to force anybody to sign that document in that meeting. It would be nice because it ties it up in a pretty little bow, and the thing's done, and you don't have to meet again until the next year. But the reality, you need to be able to go through everything and make sure you have no further questions. Also, one-to-one aid support may not be the best for your child. We hear this a lot, Missy and I. It sounds like a really good option and solution to some maybe behavioral struggles or academic struggles or attending struggles, but because it is successful, it works. Having one-to-one aid support is very beneficial. However, this is a really restricted model. You don't really understand. Sometimes we don't really like see the big picture, but if your child has a one-to-one support, that person is with them all day long. And that includes social situations at recess, maybe having to take them to the bathroom, depending on the needs. And that is very restrictive, and it does reduce opportunities for independence. The school is not going to come out the gate and say, we need to try one-to-one aid support. They're going to try a variety of things that are less restrictive. They have to prove that they are not going to work for the child, and then they move up to the next restrictive thing, and it goes all the way. And at the very, very top, with the most restricted option, one-to-one aid support is up there. So it all goes back to the least restrictive environment. We do not want to have to go to a very restrictive environment if we don't have to. So we have to prove that all of these other supports don't work. And it may feel like a very long process, and it may be frustrating because while you're waiting for all of these things to get tried and trialed, your child is struggling. Just know that this is how we have to go through things, or how the school has to go through things. That's, we don't want to come out the gate with something super restrictive. So this is the additional resources we have for you. So at the top, your child's school district and their school website are going to be very, very important, because like we said, most of these things are really, really similar across state lines, but some might be minute differences. So Googling your district's state of education is going to be good. It's going to have a plethora of information. But also with that, when you see a lot of legal jargon and all of those terminologies, it's nice to be able to use something else to be able to define and like help you understand those terms, because there's a lot of them. So understood.com does break down IEP terminology and very, very easy to understand definitions, because it is a headache. There's so many different terms and acronyms, and it just becomes overwhelming. So understood.com is a really good resource. And then Missy, do you want to go over what the rest of those are?
I just listed a lot of the different procedural safeguards from different states as well as different districts in San Diego. I also put the link for IDEA, as well as their roadmap to development Q&A and implementation of IEPs, which is just like a Q&A made for families. I just put a few different examples of the procedural safeguards so everybody could see that they're pretty similar, like state to state, district to district, with some maybe minor organizational differences. And also just as an example of like where you can find your procedural safeguards for your district, if you just Google your district and procedural safeguards, it should take you to your district special education page where the procedural safeguards will be listed.
And they are legally required to have those posted publicly. So it should be just an easy Google search. So I think that's the end of the formal presentation. I'll leave our contact info up on the screen. Feel free to reach out to any of us via email at any time. We're happy to answer any additional questions, but I guess we can open it up now to some questions.
All right. We do have several questions. I'll try to see if I can group them together. So we have some questions about assessments. What assessment do we ask for if we want your child switched from a SAI to Gen Ed?
So Missy, correct me if I'm wrong, but is there a formal assessment for that, or can you just revoke? You can say that you don't want SAI, correct?
So in order to just say that you didn't want SAI, you'd have to revoke special education services. But what you can do is you can request a change of placement, which is usually done through the specific formalized assessments. They do the formal assessments every 3 years, but you can ask for an early triennial IEP. You can ask that they move it up, and really you can ask them to reassess at any time. And so then what they'll usually do is they'll do the academic, psychological, speech, whatever other services they receive assessments. And they'll also look at your child's like work completion, and like behavior and what would be needed to make them successful in general education. And then even once there's in general education, there's so many different placement options depending on the district. For example, your child could be in SDC for part of the day, and then general education for like 30% of the day, or they could be in general education for 20% of the day and SDC for 80% of the day. There's really a lot of variation. It all depends on your child's needs, their current levels, and and the programs offered by the school district. And so then the other thing is, like, if you didn't want them in special ed at all, like receive no support at all, you could revoke special education services. You do have that right. But just so you know, like if you do take that right, that removes everything. That removes resource support in the general ed classroom. That removes the option of part day SDC and part day general ed. I would just request a formal assessment, and also just request more information about what skills or present levels your child would need in order to participate in the program that you have in mind, and get more information about the programs that your district does offer.
Okay, another assessment question. What assessment should I request for a child who has gross motor planning delays and fine motor skills delays?
Because I'm not an OT, I don't know specifics. There are so many different types of assessments. Speech, OT, adaptive PE, they have probably dozens of assessments they may use. It is going to be requesting for an OT evaluation is going to be the first step. Is I think that so-and-so is having issues with fine motor. They can't grasp their pencil. They're having a really hard time writing. Writing is a huge fight. I would like to have an OT evaluation to address these things, and they will go and assess. They will go observe the child and see, okay, I'm going to use this assessment. I'm going to use this tool because that's their area of expertise. It's not like one assessment. There's a plethora, and a lot of them will use multiple assessments. They won't just pick one. They might supplement with other ones too.
And we've got a few questions about the timing of the IEP meetings again. So maybe you could just kind of run through that one more time, like how long the IEPs last. A couple questions about like transitioning from preschool to elementary school, and then also upper grades, elementary to middle.
Yeah.
And then also about transitioning between school districts and even states. So a lot
Okay.
of questions around those.
Yeah. So as far as when IEPs are scheduled, it's one time per year, unless you request or the school requests an emergency IEP, and then it needs to be held within 30 days of that request. The triennial is every 3 years. And then as far as the duration of the meeting, I've sat in meetings that are 30 minutes. I've sat in meetings that are 3 hours. It really just depends. If you have a parent who asks a lot of questions and really wants like thorough explanations of the present levels and what they mean, and maybe there's some disagreement, they will be longer. I would say I feel like the standard is 2, but I've also sat in ones that are an hour. For triennials, they're a little bit longer because you're reviewing a lot of different assessment results. So there's not really one set time, but they should tell you how long, like when you get the notice that the IEP has been scheduled, they should tell you that like we've scheduled an hour or we've scheduled like 2 hours. If there's like a parent that typically has longer IEPs because they do ask a lot of questions, they might just come out the gate and make sure to block off more time. But there's not really one set criteria. And then as far as transitioning between like preschool and kindergarten, you should, and same thing if you go from like elementary school to middle school, there should be a transition meeting. So I know for preschoolers, you will be on an IEP with your IEP team at that preschool with that district. And then ideally before the school year ends, before the child is moving to another school, going up to kindergarten, there needs to be a transition meeting about, okay, so based on your child's needs of how they've done here and where they're currently at, they need these services. This school in our district has these services. It would be best suited that your child goes here. And then the IEP that is written at that time at that transition meeting is implemented at the new school. It's the same thing with like going from elementary school to middle school or middle school to high school. It's the same thing. And sometimes I've sat in meetings where it's pretty rare, but I have sat in meetings where the school will be like, this child, the student needs these things. We don't really have a program that addresses these things or these areas of need with the programs and the supports that your child needs. They might be better suited in like the neighboring district. But and Missy, we talked about this earlier too, where you can potentially, the school will sometimes build up the supports for the child there based on their needs, but it's all really just based on where they're at, those present levels. How are they making progress on the goals? Have they regressed? We saw a lot of that with COVID because kids were not in school. So it really just depends, but they should propose a school for you in that district, best case scenario that like works. And sometimes it's your home school, the one that like qualifies based on your address, and sometimes it's not. If they are not your home school, they have to provide transportation options. And you can reject them, but they have to provide some way, especially if it's outside of the district, they have to present an option for your child getting to that school. And that might differ from district to district. I know my background in a non-public school, all of the kids were bused to my school, and it was in their IEP that they were supposed to have transportation because the school was located in San Marcos, and all of the kids were all over northern San Diego. Were there any other questions about that topic? Did I hit all of them?
I think the only other one maybe is if you're moving to a new state.
Yes. So if you're moving to a new state or you're moving to a new district, the IEP stays the same. The minute you go to the school, they should be implementing those services. But what would happen is that you would get a 30-day check-in where the IEP team sits down and goes over like, this is how your child's adjusting. These are some of the things that we're noticing. Usually that transition's a little rough for students, for everybody, because it's a huge transition, but they do like a basic check-in and they see if they need to modify any additional things in the IEP. But regardless, the IEP, whether you move from California to Arizona or California to New York, the IEP itself needs to be implemented as written wherever you go, but you do need to have a 30-day check-in with your IEP team.
I have a couple of questions about 504 plans. Is a 504 conducted as part of a parent-teacher conference, and who should be present for a 504 plan meeting?
So it really depends. Like we said, like the IEP team is very formal and it's very listed out, like there needs to be an administrator, the general education and the special education teacher needs to be present. But for a 504 plan, it's whatever those goals in that 504 plan, and whoever's responsible for running them would be present. So sometimes 504 plans have nothing to do with academics. Maybe they have something to do with like social, emotional behavior stuff. So maybe like the school psychologist will be present for the 504 meeting, and maybe not anybody else. It really just depends. Maybe it's the speech is there, the teacher's there, and that's it. It really just depends. But I do want to make sure it's known that 504 plans don't have to be academic. They can be. And you know, they would qualify because it impacts their like academics and their accessing of the general education curriculum, but maybe they need counseling services or something like that. But it's not necessarily like a formal, like a parent teacher conference, but it is a meeting between whoever it makes sense to have there, because they're directly working with your child.
And how long does the 504 plan last?
Typically meetings are every year, and there's less like guidelines about it. It says it can be held within a year or every year, and then every 3 years there's that reevaluation. It could happen less, but if you feel like a meeting needs to take place and it's hit that year mark, you need to request so. But like with an IEP, there's very strict guidelines where if it doesn't happen by this date, the district's in trouble. That doesn't really apply for a 504 plan, but they should, as a general rule of thumb, happen about every year, because that's usually when you can really reassess where the progress is being made and where services need to be tweaked and whatnot. But it's not as formal.
Another IEP meeting question. Do you recommend IEP meetings for multiple kids on separate days?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm trying to think if I had to sit in on 2 IEP meetings in a day. I know as like a BCBA, having to sit on meetings, sitting in 2 on a day is emotionally draining. If you had to sit on 2 the same day with both of your children, that's probably going to be really tough. I would suggest having them on separate days. I know some parents probably just want to get it done and over with, but I mean, what if you had one that was really like you had a morning IEP for one child, it was really heated, and you're bringing all of that kind of stress to your second kid's IEP, and you're kind of it's not leaving you open to being able to talk about your other child. That's just my suggestion, is having them on separate days.
I'm gonna piggyback on what Alison said and say that I completely agree. When I was a special ed teacher, I had plenty of families with 2 kids with IEPs, and we always recommended that they be held, at least a few days apart at the very least. Usually we try to have them a week apart, because it's really important, I think, to be able to just focus on that child's, the particular child in question's needs during that meeting, and make sure that you feel like it's a good fit. And I feel like after like 1 2-hour IEP meeting, even like as a special ed teacher, like I was usually done. I was like drained, and I can't even imagine as a parent where I'm the person that's being directly affected by this. IEP meetings are long and draining, and there's a lot of questions that get asked, and sometimes things, even if you like everything, sometimes they get really emotional just because you feel like maybe your child is not making enough progress, maybe you're floored by the amount of progress, maybe you feel emotional because you can't even imagine how like you didn't think they would get there 2 years ago. I just think IEPs are really emotional, and I think it's really important to give yourself a break between IEPs. I mean, you know yourself best, and you know your children best, but I always just like to recommend to families that if you can take a break between them, do it, just for your own like mental health and well-being.
Thank you. I do have a few more questions for you. What are some examples that you have of alternatives to having a one-to-one aide? Because it seems that having a one-to-one aide is like the gold standard for that other parents refer to.
Yeah, Missy and I could probably both take this like together, because I'm sure we both have some thoughts. But at least for me, yes, a one-to-one aide is seen as like this gold standard, but it's the gold standard is subjective based on the kid. I mean, obviously everyone's gonna, I mean, kids are gonna be successful if they have someone on them all day at school, ensuring that they're doing their work, that they're getting breaks if like they notice the child's getting escalated. But again, that's very restrictive. You're going to have a person with you all day. It can be a little socially stigmatizing, because maybe that aide goes out to recess with them and the other kids are like, why is an adult following you as like a shadow? I've heard kids say that. And that's also like a greater lesson to start talking about, like everyone's got different like support needs and stuff like that, but it can be a little stigmatizing. And also a lot of times I feel sometimes parents do feel like their child needs an aide when it's not actually beneficial. Other options too is that maybe there's a classroom aide that supports like specific kids in the class but is labeled a classroom aide. There's also like 1 to 3 support. The non-public school I worked at, some kids were 1 to 7 support, which just basically meant that there was a classroom aide in the classroom that kind of checked in with all of the kids and like paid special attention to him based on like his needs. There's also like behavior management systems. I know for some kids, if there's like a behavior specialist or a BCBA or a school psychologist, because all of those different people can be serving the same function of addressing behavior challenges, they might have like a check-in once a day where the person goes into the classroom to like check in with the teacher, check in with the kid. There might be a really common one we've used in schools is like a behavior self-monitoring chart, where like the child has to list out what the expectations are. Like say the things that they need to work on is having a calm body, using their words, and asking for a break. Maybe those are the 3 things that everybody's decided that needs to be worked on. And the kid might have like a system in place that is kind of independently run with like check-ins with the teacher, where they go in and they check in after every single activity. Okay, let me think. When we did math today, was I having a safe body? Was I using my words? And they go through and they grade themselves, and it's like tied into a reinforcement system. And also reinforcement systems. There's classroom ones. We talked about classroom dojo, but like there's other things where, you know, maybe there's like a marble jar and like based on how the class is acting or certain students are acting, if they're engaging in appropriate behavior, maybe they earn marbles, and when it gets to the top they get a pizza party or something like that. Most classrooms will use some sort of classroom management system like that, but sometimes they might have more specialized, individualized reinforcement systems as well. Missy, I don't know if you have any. I'm sure you have much more to add.
I think the thing that I really want to propose about the aid is people talk about it as a gold standard, but having been in the classroom myself for a long time, like I noticed a lot of the time the aides weren't given sufficient training. And so it was kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a big gaping wound. I mean, imagine this, like picture this, there's this kid that's in the classroom every day and they're like, oh, we're just give him an aid. And so then anytime there's difficulty or the kid seems upset, the aide just takes him out and the school thinks problem solved. But is the problem really solved? Did anybody ever stop and think, well, why is this child wrecking the room every day? What does this child need that they're not getting? Or rather, what is in place that is frustrating this child to this point? What do we need to do to the environment to support this child? So I feel like sometimes when a one-to-one is given, it's oftentimes just thrown on as a, well, this is what we're going to do to solve the problem, and now the problem is solved. But is the problem really solved? Is this the correct placement for the child? If the child is a one-to-one, barring like a physical need in their classroom, just to be able to be like on task and participate in class, is that really the least restrictive setting for them? Is that classroom really appropriate for them? So maybe, you know, I've had to have really tough conversations with families of like, yes, I understand that you really want your child in general ed, but your child is struggling. You know, like I understand that general ed is the ideal, and I understand that you really feel like they need to be with their peers most of the day, but your child is reading 4 grade levels below, and they are just so frustrated and overwhelmed. And is having one person there just for your child going to be really what's going to benefit them in the long run? Or would it be better for them to be in a classroom with peers who are at their same level, where they might not be as self-conscious about their reading or math ability, and they might have more individualized supports built into the classroom because it's a smaller class size? And so those are just my thoughts about the one-to-one. It can, I'm sure for some kids, it can be a gold standard, especially if there's a physical limitation or disability. But for your everyday, like average one-to-one, I feel like it's often misused and just thrown in to avoid addressing a bigger issue.
Yeah. And also to kind of add additional information just from personal experience, I definitely agree. A lot of the time aides aren't provided sufficient training. And also it is a higher turnover job, especially right now. So, you know, your child might have a bond with their aide that they've had for three months, and then all of a sudden that aide doesn't show up on Monday, and the district has to find somebody last minute to just throw in there because we have to fulfill the services. In addition, I've also seen where students will rely on the aide instead of really trying to learn a replacement strategy. So we talked about with the FBA, where we're looking at, why is the child engaging in this behavior? Are they trying to escape a task that they don't like? Okay, then we need to find a functional replacement for that. We need to teach them, maybe they need to ask for a break, or maybe they just need to ask for working in a room that has less distractions because they get frustrated if like kids are talking. There's a lot of different things, but we need to be actively teaching a replacement, because the behavior is just not going to go away just because we intervene. We need to also be putting in steps to make sure that we're teaching them a replacement skill, because they're going to have to try to get their needs met, and they're currently doing it inappropriately. But also I've seen where a lot of the times where an aide's not really providing that learning opportunity because they don't know any better, because they haven't been trained on it. You know, so it can be great for some kids, and other kids it can be misused, or it can be kind of just like a babysitter. I've seen that too, where they kind of just sit next to the kid and you know, kind of jump in as a reactionary thing instead of doing some preventative strategy. So there's a whole list of reasons. I think aides are great? Yes, but there's definitely a time and a place for it. And unfortunately, sometimes it does feel like that is the gold standard, but it really isn't for all students.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give us time for a couple more questions. I know we've gone over, so thank you so much for, again, spending your time with us tonight. I will say I've gotten several questions asking for a copy of the presentation. So this webinar is being recorded, and I will share that out with everybody, as well as the link to the resources that were mentioned. And we'll just get the last couple of questions here, and then we'll sign off for the evening. But you can follow up with us as well if you have other questions. I know this is a big topic, and so that's why we wanted to provide this opportunity tonight to present this information. For autism, what other type of assessment or evaluation would you ask the IEP team for besides OT and speech?
Oh, there's many. You know, they could have adapted PE services. So there might be an assessment to look at adapted PE goals, lots of reading assessments, writing assessments, math assessments, like in terms of academic, but also behavioral support, counseling support, social support, social skills support. I mean, there's like there's so many. Can you think of any others off the top of your head, Misty?
I can't think of anything else. I think it really depends on your child and their need. Just one little thing that I always think about is when a child is like really struggling in reading, you might consider asking for a specific eval for dyslexia. That's really just the only thing is like that. A lot of kids are diagnosed too late. And so I always just like to tell families that there are like specialized assessments underneath like the different subjects. And so if you feel like your child is really struggling, you might reach out to your school team and ask if they think that that could be a concern.
Yeah, in addition to actual assessments, like the list of potential modifications, accommodations, and services is like a mile long. It could be, a visual support schedule, a behavior management system, a slant board, an adapted pencil, adapted scissors, adapted keyboard, a hearing device, visual impairment stuff, sitting at the front of the classroom, sitting towards the back of the classroom, going into a smaller classroom for a resource classroom for one specific topic. There's the list is mile long. It's just all depending on what's going to benefit the student.
Okay, and then if I want an independent evaluation done of my child's behavior in the classroom, can I request to have that done?
You want to take that one, Missy?
You can request that, but the first thing you have to like follow a procedure. So the thing with the school district is there is like kind of a path that you have to follow. So if you want the independent evaluation, what first has to happen is you have to request the FBA done by school staff, because as much as possible, like the district wants to do things in-house, and they are not required to provide the independent evaluation unless they provide their own evaluation. You disagree with that evaluation, you write a letter saying you disagree with that, or you state that you disagree with that, and then you request the independent evaluation. So the whole thing of the independent evaluation is when there's disagreements in assessment results between family and the school, but first the school has to provide the assessment. And then there has to be a discussion about it. And then like, again, if there can be no resolution between the discrepancies that you feel like are between what you see in the results of the district assessments, then you can ask for the independent evaluation. And as far as us doing a third party one out of pocket, I saw that somewhere in the chat. A lot of times parents will have third party evaluations done by their doctors or their private speech therapists. But the problem is that unless it's done by the district, number one, it's really hard to have them come and observe your child, because the school district's kind of like the schools are kind of like a secure place. And they would, they have like a specific third party company that's already had the live scan clearance to come in and observe in their district. But the other thing is, like, if you bring in an independent evaluation, like an evaluation from outside of school, then oftentimes it's just like, well, that's great, but that's in a different setting, because the evaluation needs to be specific to this child's classroom and environment and specific needs in school. So you could have a really great assessment from your speech therapist, your private speech therapist, and you could bring that into school and be like, hey, I just wanted to give you this for your information. And that would be great, but it would really just be like additional information for the school team, and it really couldn't influence any IEP decisions.
What can you do if you don't feel like you're getting enough hours, like for speech or OT?
Yeah, the first thing is when you do have that IEP meeting, make sure they document that in the notes section that you have a concern about that. If they don't put it in writing, like Missy said earlier, that's a red flag. You can say that you feel like your child needs to get more, and then they have to evaluate if that's going to be doable. They'll basically go back to the drawing board to see, like, is there something that we can modify? They may decide no, but they might say, like, you know what, you're right, we did an additional assessment, we do think your child qualifies for additional minutes for speech or whatever. I know as long as it's documented, that's like the most important thing. And yeah, I know sometimes some families will say, I want more one-on-one speech therapy and less group. And sometimes it's just as easy as the IEP team saying, yeah, sure. And they make that change right there. But as long as they're documenting it, that process can at least start to see if that's going to be doable. But also too, like going back to like green flags versus red flags, if your child is not demonstrating progress with the services that are in place, that's a huge red flag, and you should definitely make that note. And you can go through like the appeal, or not the appeal, but like file a complaint, have mediation, no resolution has happened, you can go to due process. But especially if like the data is showing that like, hey, these supports have been in place for the last year and minimal progress has happened, the IEP team should already be looking at that. But if they're not, then definitely bring it up, and you know, bring it up a lot until it gets addressed for sure.
And I did get a question earlier about the translation services. How long do they have to provide the translated IEP assessments?
Do you know the number on that, Missy? I don't know an exact number, but
I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but I believe it's within 30 days.
I believe it is as well. They might not get it to you by day 30, but that's when you should start to be concerned and start really pushing for it and documenting that you don't have it. But you can also request all of that stuff prior to the IEP as well, so they know.
And the last question, any tips for a 3-year-old about to have their first IEP assessment meeting for preschool?
Oh, that's a great question. Usually just going in with like all the questions, write down, take notes. If you need to have, if you're already receiving services, say your child's getting in-home ABA therapy or speech therapy already, definitely see if that person that works with your child already, that knows your child, can attend. Take all the notes, ask all the questions. A lot of the times when there is an IEP in a preschool setting, the IEP team knows that it's usually the first or second IEP that this child has had, so they are aware of that, and they should not be breezing through it. They should be taking the time to make sure that you understand each step of the process, every page of the report, the procedural safeguards, the service minutes, and why you've requested these things. Just definitely ask questions, and if definitely have those red flags and those green flags written out, and look for those in your child's IEP. If they're not there, file a complaint, and a written complaint to the school and the school district.
I also just want to add, you know what, when you're really concerned about something, I would have an open conversation with your child's school team, even if you just like meet with the teacher before the IEP to discuss your concerns, so you can make sure they address it. I think maybe I'm a little biased because I was in the classroom myself for a while before becoming a BCBA. Like, I feel like the special ed teacher really, really, really wants to help your child by and large. There is a lot of political like red tape and like rules that the people that are working directly with the kids often have to follow. And there's things that they're not able to say or not allowed to say or told that they really shouldn't say by maybe people who have a little bit more power in the district. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of other people other than the teacher or the speech language patterns. And I really highly recommend, even before the IEP, if you could just sit down with your child's teacher or sit down with their child's speech language pathologist and be like, hey, just before the IEP meeting, can I just, have like 5 minutes of your time just to tell you that I'm really worried about Johnny, and I'd really like us to talk about this at the IEP meeting. For bigger concerns, I definitely highly recommend an amendment. But before your IEP meeting, even, you can always just reach out and be like, hey, I'm really concerned about, his math, and I would really appreciate it if you could come up with some ideas for the IEP to support him in math. Or, I'm really concerned about his behavior. I would love to hear any ideas you have at the IEP about what we can do to support them.
And we did get a comment as well that some school districts may have like support groups or like a Facebook group specifically for parents in that school district, which can help as well, just so that you can kind of get advice and chat with other parents too, specifically in your area or in your school district.
Yeah, I would say too, I find just in my career that parents are also a wonderful resource because in regards to like special ed stuff, a lot of parents have been through the ringer and they will be very vocal about the things that they learned. So parent groups too are great. Parents have a wonderful amount of information that they're just hoping to share. So if something happened to them, they don't want it to happen to anyone else, or if they just have some insight or perspective for their district, there's lots of those groups on social media.
Sorry, we did get one related question.
Sure.
Can a teacher try out a new strategy with my child with consent prior to making a recommendation at the IEP meeting?
I think it depends on what it is, right? But most likely, what do you think, Missy?
It really depends on what it is. I mean, everything the teacher does like doesn't have to be in the IEP, because that would make being a teacher like super difficult. So if it's a really major change, like if they're sending them to a different classroom, I would say no. But if they're like, oh, I'm trying to have them write in highlighter today instead of pencil to see if that makes writing easier, or you know what, I thought that maybe if I move Johnny's desk a little bit closer to Stacy, that he might be a little bit more successful. Those are things that I would say no. I think it really depends on like what the strategy is. If it's like, I'm going to send him to the office every hour, I would say definitely like that needs to be talked about as a team. But just minor things like day-to-day classroom procedures, definitely not. Or maybe they want to change up their token board and be like, oh, I'm going to try them with Paw Patrol tokens instead of star tokens, or I'm going to give them a numbers with their token board, or I'm going to put a visual reminder on their desk. I think as long as it's within reason, it's fine. They don't need to have it at the IEP meeting. It kind of falls under our idea of PBS, like our tier 1 or tier 2 interventions. It's when we get into tier 3, like maybe adding a behavior plan, that would definitely need to be at the IEP, because a teacher might try out a strategy to see if it actually needs to be addressed in the IEP as like a support. So maybe Johnny maybe they tried the visual schedule and it works. And then they say, hey, I just wanted to let you know I tried a visual schedule and it worked great. So we're going to put that into the accommodations page. But they might not want to put that into the accommodations page if they feel like it's just going to be ineffective. So maybe he hates the visual schedule. Maybe he wants to rep the visual schedule every time he sees it. But if it's in his IEP, it has to be provided. So I think it's just really important to think about like what that strategy is and what its purpose is.
Yeah, and for something like if your child wears glasses or is getting evaluated to wear glasses, you don't have to wait till an IEP meeting to let the teacher know that like, hey, we're having some struggles with our vision, even though that's like not something that was one of the disabilities that qualified for your child for an IEP. You can say, hey, can we just move his desk up closer to the board? I think he's having a hard time seeing. And then they can do that. Should that eventually get put in the IEP if it's effective? Yes, because then that just protects you if you do move to another classroom or another district. They know right off the bat that that's a strategy that helps your child and it should just be done. But you can also ask for additional small supports without having this formal meeting. But if they are helpful and they help your child be successful, they should be documented at some point in the IEP. So everybody is aware that these strategies work.
Excellent. That, I believe, is the final question. I know we got a lot of questions, so hopefully we addressed them all. Thank you so much, everybody. And again, I will send a follow-up email out tomorrow with a link to the recording and those resources. We're getting a lot of thank yous in the chat box. So thank you all for spending your time with us, and to Alison and Missy for presenting all of this fantastic information. So stay tuned. We do these monthly webinars and every month, and the next one will be on feeding therapy in November. So we will be sending that information out, and you can join us for that one as well if you'd like. So thank you again so much. We will sign off, and we'll be in touch. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.